Hi, it's Paul Batis with GreatDad.com again with my series talking to modern dads and parenting. And I've got today a guest who's also a friend of God. We've known each other for about 20 years, Wayne. So welcome,
Yeah.
Wayne Boatwright.
Thank you, Paul. It's wonderful to be here, and I love the aspirational title, Great Dad, right?
Yeah, well, I think it is an aspirational title because we all try to do the best we can. And like I say, if you're doing the best you can, you're doing the best you can. You have an interesting approach or an interesting history with fatherhood that I think is going to be somewhat painful for maybe for our listeners and for me to hear about and relive a little bit. And I don't know if we want to start with that framing. The last time we got together with our families was a brunch when our kids were, I don't know, maybe 6 and 2 or something. We had kids the exact same age. Our wives went to the same church. We kind of were in the same social circle, and we'd see each other at the industry parties around San Francisco. And then something horrible happened. And I don't know if you want to start with that.
I will get to that, but to keep people's interest, my children are now 18 and 20.
Yeah.
My daughter is a senior in high school. She's the captain of her varsity golf team and has been for 2 years. She's the vice president of her high school. She goes to a school called Choate Rosemary Hall in Wallingford, Connecticut. My son is a sophomore at Cornell, spending this semester in Washington, D.C., because Cornell has a satellite campus there. And so they're both doing amazingly well, and I'm very proud of them. And to be honest, proud of what I have done to try my best to be a great father, because that was by no means a guarantee in my life. I missed much of their childhood and viscerally injured my children. I committed a crime, and I'll explain that in a second, but they were 5 and 7 when I committed my crime, and they were 6 and 8 when I went to prison. And I served over 6 years in San Quentin State Prison, a very famous prison in California, but also pretty well known around the world because it houses California's death row. It has over 700 inmates. California doesn't practice execution, but they still have a death row, and there's over 700 guys there. And so I was at San Quentin for over 6 years and have been home about 5 now. I served from 2012 to 2019 and have been home since then, and have had to work to repair the relationship with my kids that, like a tapestry, I had torn asunder with my actions. And I think my goal for our conversation is to talk about the tools that I developed and worked and have used to reweave that tapestry and to make it healthy and strong, because I do consider myself to have a very good relationship with my children, and I'm very proud of that.
Yeah, and I think that is important. It is important for people to understand that something horrible can happen, and we're all horribly human, and that there are things that you can do to keep that relationship and still grow that relationship, even though I'm sure at one point you felt like, it was over and it would be almost impossible to recapture that with them.
Absolutely, it felt that way, especially when 4 months into my sentence, my wife and the mother of my 2 children, we'd been married for 14 years at the time, she came and asked me for a divorce. I like to explain my crime and that experience of losing my family legally, not just physically by going to prison, as I burned down my psychic delusion house that I had built up over my life based on my experience, my education, my faith. We build this place we live in as people, right? The persona that we present to others. And I destroyed mine with my crime. In my case, my crime was addiction related. I was an alcoholic, a functional alcoholic. And I was driving while intoxicated, and I took a life with my crime. So I killed someone in a drunk driving accident, but it's a crime. And you talk about horrible things, but you can't imagine true horror like it is waking up in a hospital and being told that you've taken someone's life. The power that represents, that you have the power to do that, to tear somebody out of their family permanently without their will or their desire, and to destroy that family in many ways by your own actions. And the realization that you In my case, the realization that I had a responsibility to learn how I could be that monster, that monstrous, that horrific, and what I needed to do to make sure that could never happen again, that I would never put people at risk like that again. That process of introspection and recognition and the journey of understanding how that could happen and then what tools you would need to make sure it wouldn't happen again, and how to develop those tools and how to practice that in real life is a journey nobody wants to take.
Yeah. Well, I've always been stricken by your story, because even from the early days when you were writing from San Quentin, you never presented yourself in any way as a victim of the circumstances, or a victim of your ex-wife rejecting you, that somehow that she was the one who didn't stand by you, or that you always took full responsibility for what had occurred, and also responsibility for what happens afterwards. Like, it's not a that was then, I'm out and now I'm moving on with my life story, but you've really committed your life now to working with both men at San Quentin and outside of San Quentin for some attempt at redemption. And I'd be interested in hearing whether you feel redemption itself is ever even really possible, or just something that you're striving, that will always be somewhere there in the distance.
One of the recognitions that I've made is that our consciousness, the self that we recognize, is an infinite loop. It's a story we tell ourselves. And the reality is that we live in the future, that place we're going to. The present is fixed. It can't change. But it's the past that's always changing, because we retell that story in different ways. We understand it in different ways. I never knew, for example, that I could be a horrible life taker, but the present happened. I committed that crime. And I've had to rewrite that story backwards. Well, yes, you were, but are you going to stay that person? Are you going to voluntarily take action to be somebody else? And what will that action be? And what do you want to become? That future that we live in, of hope and opportunity and possibility. Neither of us knew what was going to happen on this podcast. We do have a history, and we've known each other for, again, well over 20 years in many ways. And yet here we are. And this present is fixed, and I could say anything, and you might publish it or not, but that's where we are. And so I think that visual, that understanding of a changing past it doesn't change quickly. It's a process, but I'm speaking to the unconscious or subconscious part of us that is the vast majority of us. If you ever heard of Jonathan Haidt, he's very famous right now for especially focusing with teens and young girls and the challenges they're facing. A former NYU professor, very well respected in his community, and taking a somewhat unpopular view of technology and the challenges it's faced. But one of the concepts he came up with that I would invite the audience to consider is he came up with a concept known as the elephant and the rider. And this is kind of a play on the Buddhist concept of the 6 blind men and the elephant, if you know that fable, right? So the elephant is our brain-body existence, and the rider is our conscious, rational mind. And we think we control the elephant, but we're only a rider on the elephant. The elephant has a lot more control over our existence, and we rationalize what we do. We're not rational beings most of the time. We rationalize our actions. You just mentioned an example that's very common of people focusing on and living in their victimhood to justify their actions. That's a rationalization. That's not rational of what really happened. And so the elephant and the rider construct is very real. And so part of what I've learned and the tools I've developed are what are better ways I can deal with my elephant, that body, brain, physical brain aspect, not the emergent mind and consciousness that exists and rides on top of it. And so I would invite people to think about some of the metaphors and examples I use as deliberate, but I'm not talking to their rider, I'm talking to their elephant, and trying to communicate with the whole person and give them a better chance of accomplishing the goals they have. I mentioned that I was an alcoholic, and addiction, for example, of how these things are misunderstood. Matthew Perry is a famous actor who recently took his own life by overdose, right? And we've all heard his long journey of challenges and how he's tried to face his addiction and deal with it. And he failed. Luckily, he didn't take another life with him like I did with my crime, but he couldn't develop the tools necessary to overcome his addiction. But I would contend the addiction never was the problem in the first place. Mm-hmm. The addiction is a coping mechanism that you're using because of the problem. The problem underlies the addiction. And that addiction could be sex. That addiction could be overwork. That addiction could be extreme sports. All of these things are different ways that we cope with challenges that we have. And most of those challenges are based upon an earlier trauma that we've experienced. But again, much like we look in a mirror and we think that's reality, the mirror is the inverse of reality. I would contend that the trauma is not the event that someone experienced. I work a lot with young men who may not be in prison yet, and a lot of guys in prison, and many of them have committed rape, for example, and they're not willing to face that they've committed those actions. But I would contend the rape itself isn't the trauma the woman experienced. The trauma is how she copes with the fact that she was raped. And we need to deal with that because many people have bad coping mechanisms, maladaptions, they're called. But those maladaptions seem justified to us because we know we have this underlying issue that we have to deal with, often not at the conscious level. There's a concept known as the body keeps the score,
right? Which
is where part of us below our consciousness, we know what that traumatic experience was, but our conscious mind may not remember it. And the coping mechanisms that we develop are the problem. And too much of our mental health professions and other people and a lot of the life coaches, I believe, focus on the coping mechanism that is not healthy. But most people will just find another coping mechanism if you don't deal with the underlying issue. And so I was lucky enough, I mentioned San Quentin and how it's an infamous prison, but I count myself lucky to have gone to San Quentin. San Quentin, so before my crime, I was a professional. I went to Cornell Law School. I was a practicing attorney, but I wasn't the type of attorney you see on TV. I was a business lawyer. I worked with corporations and startups. I worked in LA at a global law firm. I worked in Korea for 6 years as a foreign legal consultant at a law firm that now generates over $1 billion in business as a law firm. So very big, very successful. And then I worked at Accenture, which is a top consulting firm, in their corporate headquarters in Palo Alto, and I got bit by the startup bug. So the whole concept of our startup community and what Silicon Valley is in the Bay Area and what it's creating is something that I think San Quentin is analogous to Silicon Valley in restorative justice attempts. It has more nonprofits and advocacy groups that go there as volunteers and invite men to participate in different groups and different organizations to try to take responsibility for their actions and learn the tools they need to return to full citizenship and to be beneficial members of their community. You know, to wrap this back up to where you started about redemption, no, there is no redemption in my world. I call myself a returning citizen because I will never return. I destroyed my life, not just because I was disbarred because I committed a felony and can't practice law, but by the divorce that came as a consequence of that a few months into my sentence. And so my children lost not just the physical presence of a father, but more so with divorce. And so the role of co-parenting became central to me, not a husband, but as a co-parent. And it's a process that I've embraced fully and one that I find has been very successful. I am eternally grateful to my ex-wife, and I like to call her X. By the way, it helps me deal with it. You know, the ex, even though she divorced me, honored her commitment and continued to bring our children to visit me, even when I was in San Quentin. And trust me, to visit somebody in prison is much more difficult and arduous and challenging than you could ever imagine in our strata. And as I imagine the strata of most of the audience who will listen to this, I didn't know anybody who had ever gone to prison before I committed my crime. I doubt you know anybody, or very few people who have. No, none of us understand that world. It's a very difficult world. And yet my ex honored her responsibility as a co-parent to keep me in my children's lives and allow them to visit me for the 6 years I was in San Quentin, and has continued to encourage the relationship and between our children and their father. And I will eternally be grateful to her for that. It is a gift, of a priceless gift that she has given all of us, to be honest. And our trust is as complete as it can be as co-parents. I mentioned my daughter was 18, and for her birthday this year, I was speaking with the ex, and we decided that the good present I could give her was to repaint her bedroom. I couldn't send my daughter on a good vacation for graduating high school. I've had 28 jobs since I've come home. This week, I've worked at catering in the past 7 days. I'm a server at events that I used to attend, for example, and will see people who used to be friends and were part of my prior life before my fall, is the way I like to say it. So I don't have a lot of financial means to help my kids, but I can paint my daughter's bedroom. And I have a key to the house that my wife and her new husband live in. She got married about a year ago. They trust me completely to go to that house and to repaint the bedroom, even though they're not there. We have a very strong co-parenting relationship, and one built upon trust that allows me to, you want to make a dad proud. Boy, my daughter's, the ex, filmed the event when my daughter was surprised and came back to her room. And
Oh, yeah.
I'm thrilled by that.
So talk a little bit about when did you have to go through a process of explaining yourself to them and regaining their trust in you or their appreciation of you or anything? Or were they so young that it was too vague in their minds actually what had occurred?
Great question, and yes and no. I wouldn't contend that they're too young to understand, but developmentally they can only understand it as well as their developmental level allows them to understand it, right? There's a great author. If you haven't read her, I would highly recommend you do, and I would recommend your audience read any of her books. Her name is Alice Miller, and Alice Miller is a Swiss psychiatrist and practicing psychologist as well, who got into writing near the end of her career. She wrote one of her most famous books, translated from the original German into English, is called The Drama of the Gifted Child. And I would recommend anybody read this book. She also independently came up with the concept of the body keeps the score that we discussed, and discusses the subconscious components of trauma and how it manifests itself in people's lives. Many of them in criminality, for example, whether it be addiction or being a pimp, or being a criminal or a thief or a murderer. All of these things come because people have cut off part of usually their empathetic or emotional self as a defense mechanism. They've cut that part of themselves off, and therefore they can commit these heinous crimes, things we couldn't imagine ourselves doing, only because part of their authentic self is hidden from them as a defense mechanism, right? And so Alice Miller is great. When you talk about developmental levels, one of the terms that she came up with that I like to explain to people and recommend that everybody do is meet your child where they are. Don't try to force them to come where you are. And how does one meet them where they are? Well, that's an investigation that you go through. For example, my son was transferring to a new school, and when we got to that new school as a 6th grader, so still quite young, his classmates found out his dad was in prison, and they made fun of him for it, and they shamed him, and they embarrassed him. Well, developmentally, he thought he was angry. He didn't know he felt shame. He didn't have that level of sophistication to describe his emotional self. He stopped visiting me for 18 months.
Wow.
Because of that. 18 months, I didn't get to see my son.
And you were powerless to do anything about it.
Powerless. But I had to meet him where he was. And we still had short phone calls, even though I was in prison. That's allowed. Prison phone calls are very different. So try to imagine a dorm of 200 men in double bunks. That's where you live. No privacy whatsoever. Open bathrooms, open showers, everything. And they're a bank of 4 like old payphones that you have to schedule a time to go make a call in. And then you call somebody. I like to say in many ways I was like a ghost to my former community, because out of nowhere this strange call would appear and they could decide to accept it or not. It has to be a collect call, and you would talk with them. But you couldn't be normal in your conversation because, in our educated, elite, pretty much atheist world that we all come from, we have the courtesy not to listen in to other people's conversations. But most of the people in prison don't come from our world. They come from a place of competition and scarcity. And so they'll use any tool they can. And so you have to be very circumspect on the phone. But, my son at that age loved Harry Potter, had made it a goal of his to read. He wanted to be in the Guinness Book of World Records for reading the Harry Potter series the most times. And I think he got up to 8 times he went through the Harry Potter books. So to meet him where he was, I went to the prison library and read every single Harry Potter book.
Right.
Because I needed to be able to use the stories that he resonated with him and that were powerful to him and were true to him in many ways. I think people misconceive facts and truths. Yeah, it's a fictional novel, but it has many truths in it. It's full of truth, actually, not facts. Right. No, magic doesn't exist, and there aren't wizards, but there are truths that are taught in these stories that were given. And I was able to use those tools to reconnect with him and to use baseball. Even though my son is now 20 years old, when he came home on spring break last month, we went to the Giants home opener baseball game together. And last summer, we went to 7 Giants games together. Now, I can't sit behind home plate. We had standing seats for the Giant opener because they're expensive, and we were out in the outfield. And we didn't care, either of us, about that. Yeah. We got to share a meal and share a game and talk about baseball and how all the players are doing and who are the new ones and are they good or are they bad or how are they performing. And his excitement about baseball is something that I knew about. So I met him where he was. I had to learn about baseball. During COVID, which all of us should take a very hard look at, how COVID changed the developmental trajectory of our children, because it did change it. I don't care if you want to tell yourself it didn't. It did. And we have a responsibility as parents to meet our children where they are and the changes that they had to go through. So he was home for a long time and he loved Xbox. So to meet him where he was, I went and bought an Xbox. Sure. So in my 1-bedroom apartment, he could come play Xbox. And his favorite game was FIFA, which is the professional soccer game. And so I had to learn all about professional soccer. I didn't know the difference between a penalty and a foul. I didn't know what offsides were and all these things. And I mentioned meeting him where he was. Another term that Alice Miller uses that I use as a tool with my children is called being an enlightened witness. That's the responsibility of a parent, to be an enlightened witness. I would characterize it as being analogous to your child's front row, whether they're athletic inclined or do art or do music. You're their front row. You're cheering them on. Yep. But you're an enlightened witness. That doesn't mean you let them get away with bullshit. You got to call them on that. But I could cheer my son on as he played Xbox and talk about the different players he wanted on his team and how to compete in the different leagues that he competed in. I could be his front row. He needed that. All children need us as parents to be watching them. But be an enlightened witness. Don't be a permissive witness who says they can do whatever they want because they want to test their boundaries. I'll give you another example of that inverse understanding. We're looking in a mirror. Reality is the opposite of what we think it is. You always hear about parents being told to set boundaries for their kids. You can only have so much time online, or, you have to go to bed at a certain time or come home at a certain time. That boundary isn't for the kids. That's your boundary. That's the parent's boundary because the parents are obligated to enforce it once they've set it.
Right.
Then the kids know what the boundary is. If they come home half an hour late, there should be a consequence for that. But if there's no consequence, you're the one that has failed. It's your boundary, not the kid's boundary.
Right.
That's the concept of the enlightened witness. Be enlightened about these things. Are there exceptions? Of course there are to rules. That's your rule, not theirs. And I think people get that wrong when they talk about setting boundaries. And so you have a responsibility to actually enforce it as a parent. Be enlightened about how you do it, however, but be a witness to their lives. Don't be gone. I went to prison. I still had a BlackBerry when I went to prison, okay? The world's changed a lot when I came home. And so how do we use technology and how do we recognize technology? The way I characterize it is that there's a physical realm that we live in, and there's a digital realm that we live in. And I think people who say, oh, I was home with my kids all weekend, I would ask them, how much time did you spend in the digital realm? And how much time did you spend in the physical realm? And the same for the children. Are you with them, or are they in the digital realm?
That goes with all relationships.
With all relationships, right? But you can also meet them in the digital realm. I was an enlightened witness to my son playing Xbox. Yes, he was in the digital realm, but I was with him there.
Yeah, there's a difference there. Yeah.
I have a tradition when I do a podcast on parenting rather than adversity or addiction. And what I do is I go to my phone and I count how many communications I had with my children in the past week, in the past 7 days. I had 248 touches with my kids in the past 7 days. 248. Yes, it sounds crazy. Yes, I understand you think that, a lot of fathers. But the majority of those touches could be a single word: love. My daughter this week, she's a senior in high school, and she got into a bunch of schools, and she is leaning toward going to a school called Duke, which is in Durham, North Carolina. And part of the role of being an enlightened witness is to make sure your kids make informed decisions. So the ex is visiting Duke right now with my daughter. And so the phone is blowing up from both of them with photos and experiences. But my response might be the word love or a heart.
Yeah.
But there's 248 times I touched my kids. If we go back to that concept of the writer, and the elephant needs to know you're there. My daughter's elephant needs to know that I'm thinking about her, and that I care about her, and that I love her.
You've gotten that. If you've gotten 248 responses at the same time, that's a.
Well, 248 communications. There's definitely more on my side than theirs, but they're pretty equal with my son. It's more out of balance with my daughter, because another way I've tried to. So I destroyed, for her developmental level, when I left, it wasn't me serving sentence required by my citizenship to show that I understood what I had done and that I would take responsibility for it. It wasn't that. For her, I abandoned her. And so how do I try to show her that, no, I haven't abandoned her? Because the defense mechanism a child takes, or at least in her case that she did, is she lost the ability to trust adult men because of that. Not just me. I was her father. I was the adult man personification for her. And I abandoned her. And so she can't trust men the same way that my son can, because he was developmentally a little older and able to deal with it. So my daughter goes to high school back east, and she has a cat. And so one way I've tried to reestablish her trust is I watch her cat while she's away at school. In fact, Milky Way is the cat's name, and she may come out as we're talking. But, I've tried, and I send a Snapchat or an Instagram photo of that cat every single day to my daughter. I sent her one today of the cat sleeping, because that's what the cat's doing when I thought about it. But that's another way I've tried to reestablish and demonstrate to my daughter she can trust me. I take the responsibility of watching her cat seriously, and I send her a photo every single day. So the digital realm is a place we can meet our children and can be a very valuable tool, but we have to recognize it as a distinct realm. It's not the physical realm.
So when you had gone to San Quentin and you were away and there were these ruptures of the communication, I deal with a lot of dads, more than I ever would have thought possible, who have had ruptures in their relationship with their kids. ostensibly out of no fault of their own. Just one day the kid checked out, whether it was in high school or after high school or during college or whatever, never wants to see the dad or the mom and the dad together forever. And how was there anything? Do you think you just got lucky that your kids were willing to work through this horrible process with you? Or do you think, was there something that you were able to do to manifest the connection, the fact that you'd always be there, that they were still,
I,
there was something
um,
that was worth holding on to?
I,
Because they could have rejected you and never talked to you again.
I missed 18 months with my son,
Right.
right?
You must have been scared to death that that was it.
Scared to, I was just as scared that the ex would vilify me and not allow me to
Sure.
spend time with my kids. Luckily, she
Credit to her,
is
yeah.
an honorable woman, and I will eternally be grateful to her. She can do no wrong. And to be honest, as a co-parent, you should never, you have a responsibility to keep your relationship with your spouse separate from your relationship as a parent. So prison made me a hard man in many ways. Not a cruel person, I don't think, but a hard person. So you said, you had mentioned through no fault of their own. I disagree with you. It is your fault. You're the parent. They're not. You're the adult. They're not. I'm not saying it's 100% your fault. It is definitely your responsibility. Suck it up. Be a man about it. And one of those ways is to recognize you have to meet them where they are. If that relationship is ruptured, that means they're further away from you than they were. I'm not saying it's an easy path or an easy journey. With my daughter, because of her lack of trust, it's been a much more difficult journey for me. She loved, by the way, all the Percy Jackson books by Rick Riordan and dealt with all the different gods. So I read all of those books. Yeah, it's an investment of my time. And if you're a parent and you think you're too busy with your career or something else, suck it up. Read the books the kids care about. Watch the shows that they watch. Understand the games that they're playing. That's your responsibility, for heaven's sakes. Yeah, it is partially your fault. But you may have a longer journey and further to go to meet them where they are. You should meet them where they are. That's your obligation as a parent. But it might also be an obligation to call them out if they're using drugs as a teenager or unsafe sex. You're an enlightened witness, not just a witness to their lives. There are consequences to their actions. And unfortunately, they may not recognize that lesson until they're much older. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't teach it. I'm not saying this is easy. I was lucky that physical visiting was essential. Not just the phone calls or the letters, the fact that the ex brought them to visit me. So if parents are divorced and you have visitation rights or limited visitation rights, maximize that opportunity to be in their presence and find a way to do it one-on-one if you have more than one child. They need to have just you and your complete attention. I would invite those parents that you deal with to take that step, find a way to be alone, and if possible for an extended period of time. I was lucky last year during my son's winter break that he came and spent a week with me one-on-one for a whole week. And we were able to bond in ways that weren't possible before that. And reconnect. And the conversations we've had since that visit about a year and a half ago have been much richer and much deeper and much longer because of that week we got to spend together one-on-one. So I would invite people to find a way to do that one-on-one, but to take advantage of every single opportunity to be with their kids. I go to Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner at the house that I bought, okay? That now my wife's new husband lives in. Trust me, it's not easy at times to be in that house, but it's a chance to be with my kids. And I will go to every Thanksgiving dinner and Christmas dinner that I'm invited to go to because I get a chance to be with my children. And I'm an adult about it. And I'm grateful for the opportunity. And I thank both of them for that opportunity to be in my children's lives.
So do you think there's anything that the kids have learned from your experience? Have you been able to, communicate the entire horror of the situation and who you were before and who you are now with any kind of lessons that they can really take on?
I think that one of the things that is misunderstood by parents is that children first learned through observation. In fact, they learned everything from their parents through observation. and they're kind of in the habit of learning from you through observation. So you can talk all you want, you know, it's not going to have the impact that you want through conversation. You have to be the example of it. So I'm on the board of a nonprofit. In fact, you were kind enough to have on the founder of that nonprofit called Man to Man. Stuart was one of your guests a few years ago. And Man to Man tries to teach fatherhood values to those men who've never had a father in their lives, whether that or have failed at fatherhood themselves because they're in prison or have had other challenges. And what are the tools that they now seek to gain that they have no example of in their lives? So I'm on the board of Man to Man. I have been for 4 years. I volunteer time with other nonprofit organizations, but I can't talk about it with my kid. I can't look at dad. They have to see it. They have to hear about it. I tell you, one of the proudest things I've had is we have an annual event in Oakland at Lake Merritt with Man to Man and give the fathers a chance to celebrate with their children what they've done. And we've had, you know, congressmen and mayors and the chief of police and musicians and comedians and free food and bouncy houses and all kinds of stuff so the kids can celebrate their fathers on Father's Day. But the last 2 summers, Wesley and Cassatt both came and volunteered as teenagers to help organize and maintain these events with me. Mm-hmm. I show it to them and I invite them to come. I don't force them to come. I'm an enlightened witness, but I want them to have the opportunity to meet me where I am as well. Developmentally, they can do that now.
So, I mean, I know you said that redemption for you is not possible, but to them, do you feel like you've become now somebody that exemplifies the values, absent the horrible events, that you can imagine them admiring or looking up to or wanting to be more like as they establish their own values in their own life going forward? I guess I'm just really curious how like we all could learn something from your experience. I mean, it's impossible for us to be in your shoes, but that we could all learn to be better people, and whether your kids have learned to be better people through your personal failing.
I hope so, right? I don't like to tout that, but both my children are straight A students, even though they've had these challenges. They both have gone to elite high schools where all the other students are brilliant. I mean, both went to Choate Rosemary Hall. I'm sure some of your audience have heard of it. You know, my son is at Cornell because he's brilliant. And he got into Berkeley, but he chose Cornell because that's where he wanted to go. And my daughter was admitted to UCLA, and Cornell, but she looks like she's going to go to Duke. So yes, they've been very successful. They haven't let the trauma and the injuries that I caused them to be an open wound. They've turned it into a scar that's real and is still there. A scar, not an open wound. They're not victims of their life. I think the greatest way that I've seen it manifest itself is they've both volunteered at various nonprofit organizations during their summers related to criminal justice. My son was a junior counselor at a group called Project Avery that deals with children of incarcerated parents. And so he was a volunteer there as a junior counselor to help these other kids who are much younger have a safe community where they can live, even though they're children of incarcerated parents, not incarcerated themselves. Both of them are focused on public policy. I mentioned my son is spending the semester in Washington, D.C. this semester, and he's had sitting congressmen come to his class, and the head of the FDA come to his class, and a senior executive at the Department of Labor. And he's visited the White House 3 times this semester. But public policy is important to him, and I imagine the scars are part of the reason. He doesn't want other children to be scarred the way he was. And my daughter wants to go to Duke because they've got the top public policy school in the nation. Yeah. And she wants to do public policy. So yeah, I think they've chosen those majors for that reason. Mm-hmm. But I don't have the courage to ask them. I did ask them, what did they learn from their dad? And my daughter told me, as my Father's Day present this year, and my daughter told me that I was open in my love for her. She goes, Dad, every time you see me, you give me a hug. Even if it's in public, you give me a hug. I've also forced both of my kids to work with me during their summers at the catering company. So they wear a black vest and a tie and serve hors d'oeuvres or clean up tables with me. because I want them to learn what hard work is. Now, my son also spent his summer interning at a hedge fund, not just catering. And my daughter was at the DA's office here in San Francisco as she was interning, but she also catered because I want them to see what real work is like. And I think one of the proudest moments for me was my son came to me and said, Dad, he goes, Dad, everybody loves you. They love working with you because the owner of the company loves you. The chefs love you. The front of the house, the back of the house, the captains, the other servers, all have told me how much they love working with you and how hard you work. That I always tell them you should step up, not step back. So if somebody drops a glass and it shatters, go get a broom and help them clean it up. Don't let them do it because it's their fault. Don't be bitter about it. If somebody needs help, help them, even if it's not your responsibility. And they've seen me as an example of that. They don't know that I met George Soros and worked directly with Michael Bloomberg and met Michael Bloomberg a bunch of times. They don't know that. They know me as a guy who went to prison and has a hard time paying his rent.
Right.
But they also know that I give my all when I work, don't care what the job is. And I take it personally. I do it with a smile on my face. I step up. I don't step back. And they've learned that from me and they've told me that. And I'm very grateful to hear that. But I don't ask them. It's the Father's Day present I wanted from them.
Yeah.
To hear if they'd learned something from me. And they told me that. So.
Yeah. So final question is is there something that comes out of this that for dads who are struggling, maybe they're going through the tween years or their teen years and they know they failed in some way, too many business trips away or not enough focus on meeting them where they are or whatever. How could dads, ignite the kind of passion that you feel about these issues without having had to go through the trauma you did? Because obviously for you, there was a revelation for which I will always admire you, Wayne, just the fact that I myself really believe in redemption. I always want to see the best of people, almost always, no matter how evil they've become, that there's something in there. And you obviously have devoted your life to trying to do the things, but also go through the mental processes to try to put a framework to all this and try to understand it and become a better human being and teach the right kind of values. But is there any advice you can give to dads who are not that?
In that situation, yeah, I got you. And I thank you for saying that, Paul. I appreciate you saying that. I've found that coming from the elite, educated, atheist, successful world, that I have not been welcomed back. Yeah. I'm working at a catering company because I'm not working at a tech company that I have all the capability to work at. Understandably, people may still see me as an alcoholic, for example, even though I've been sober since I come back and take my sobriety seriously and practice that. I have no compulsion toward addiction anymore. If I were to talk to the parents, I would have a visual of a bucket of trust, like a bucket of water. And that bucket is much closer to the top than the bottom than you appreciate, because that child you've been part of their life their whole life. And a lot of that trust came before they had the verbal ways to recognize it. They trust you. Now, I overturned that bucket with my crime and leaving my family. And I'm working to refill that bucket, but it only happens a drop at a time. And I've lost it. I lost all that trust that had been built up. Not trust when they were 5 years old and you taught them to ride a bike. Trust that happened when they were 2 months old and you picked them up when they were crying. Yeah. All of you fathers have much more trust water in that bucket than you appreciate. Don't lose it and continue to build that trust. Do whatever you can to demonstrate that you are trustworthy. So if you make a commitment to be with them, don't break it. I don't care what reason you have. You're the adult. They're not. So the bucket of trust water exists. It's much fuller than you think. And your job should be to keep putting it in drop by drop. That's the most important thing you could do. In whatever way you find to do that. With my son, it was making dinner together. That was one way I could add to that trust. Because, he's been at a boarding school and then at college, he doesn't know how to cook. So in DC, he has to cook for himself. So I wanted to make sure he knew how to cook.
Yeah, right.
Right? So we practiced cooking together.
Yeah, that's great.
So there's my recommendation.
Yeah.
It's drop by drop, but do whatever you can to build trust with your children.
Yeah, it's never too late. I know a lot of men don't come to a lot of the realization of how important it is until their kids are a little bit older, and there still is always time. Well, this has been a very important conversation. I really appreciate you being vulnerable and explaining a lot of what occurred and all the challenges you've had and how you've stepped up. And obviously, I mean, it's a horrible way to learn a lesson, but you've obviously gone through a lot of deep thinking about all this. And it's just hard for anybody who's not gone through a trauma like this to even understand what it must have required for you to come out whole on the other side and be able to do some of the good things that you're doing today, Wayne.
And don't go through what I went through. If you have a problem with alcohol or addiction, find a way to face it, find a way to deal with it, but recognize that the addiction is a coping mechanism. There's an underlying issue that you're using that to feel better. There is a problem.
Yep.
You know, it's not just you're weak,
Yep.
right? And your family, there's something else. And you should try to find out what that is in whatever way that you can. I write a lot about this. I'm a lawyer by training, and I'm a business lawyer. This talking isn't comfortable for me, believe it or not. But if people would like to read my Substack, they'll find a lot of these concepts explained in much greater detail. And
you
I'd
have a
recommend
podcast as well, where you talk about some of these issues as well as parenting.
I do tons of podcasts, and not as a host, but as a guest, and people are more than welcome to look that up and find out about them. I've done well over 20, 30 of them by now.
Okay. Well, Wayne Boatwright, good. Thank you very much for making the time and helping us, our audience, understand. Again, I'm Paul Bates of GreatDad.com. And if you're interested, I run a course on developing resilience mostly for fathers trying to deal with challenges both at work and at home, using a six-week process that helps you be more aware of the things that are triggering you and how to stop those triggers from leading you into negative reactions. So if you want to check that out, it's at GreatDad.com/PQ. Until next time, take care.